Last April, I was a high school senior, counting down the days until graduation. I'd spent my entire life in the Midwest, so spring break was always my chance to escape to somewhere more exciting. That year, I was heading to Colorado with my friend Claire. She was a few years older than me and dating my best friend Ethan, who was studying at the University of Colorado. Claire happened to be moving there the same week as my break, so it worked out perfectly for me to ride along. We left late on a Friday night around 10:30 p.m. Weird time, I know, but it meant we'd avoid Chicago traffic. Most of Saturday was spent driving through endless, flat farmland. We stopped at the Black Canyon of the Gunnison, which was stunning after hours of monotony. By 11 p.m., we were both exhausted and decided to book a hotel in Wyoming, about 3 hours away. The landscape had shifted to vast stretches of open plains and Native American reservations. We turned onto a long, poorly maintained road. Only one other car was in sight, a large black SUV that had been trailing us for miles. After a while, it started tailgating us aggressively. We slowed down to let it pass, and it sped ahead. Exhausted, we figured it was just a local who knew the road well, so we picked up speed to keep up, hoping to shave some time off our trip. A few miles later, the SUV stopped and turned left, the same direction we were heading. It pulled into the parking lot of a rundown diner on the corner but didn't park. Instead, it idled, waiting. As we passed, it pulled back onto the road behind us. "Claire, I think that guy's following us," I said. She glanced in the rearview mirror. "Nah, he probably just didn't want us behind him. Some people are weird like that." I tried to shake the feeling, but sometimes was not right. A few minutes later, the SUV turned off the road, and I breathed a sigh of relief. About half an hour later, Claire was visibly struggling to stay awake. "I'll drive the rest of the way," I offered. She nodded. "Yeah, let me pull over." The problem was, the road we were on didn't connect to anything. No driveways, no gas stations, just endless plains. She started to pull off to the side when a pair of blinding headlights appeared out of nowhere, right on our tail. The SUV swerved, forcing us off the road. We skidded to a stop, hearts pounding. "What was that?" Claire whispered, her hands gripping the wheel. Before I could answer, the SUV sped ahead and stopped about 50 yards in front of us. It was the same black SUV. "Claire, don't stop. Just keep driving," I said. She hesitated, but saw the fear in my eyes and eased back onto the road. The SUV started moving again, matching our speed. Then it drove ahead. "He's following us," I said. "Just keep driving and stay alert." We continued, not seeing the SUV for another 20 minutes. Then as we passed through a tiny town, I spotted it. The SUV was parked at a stop sign on a side road facing us, lights off. As we drove by, its headlights flicked on, and it fell in behind us. Claire's hands tightened on the wheel. "Okay, I'm calling 911. We were in the middle of nowhere, though, and her phone kept dropping the call. The dispatcher couldn't pinpoint our location, and my phone's map wouldn't load. The SUV passed us again, and I shouted, "Speed up! I need to get the license plate." We managed to catch it just before it disappeared into the darkness. The dispatcher finally located us and told us to head to the nearest police station, about 15 minutes away. "Don't stop. He's staying ahead of you, figuring out your route." He knew where we were going, even when we didn't. We drove on, the SUV appearing behind us one last time before vanishing again. I pulled up directions to the police station and we were almost there. At a red light, Claire hesitated. "Do we turn here?" I didn't answer. The road looked too isolated, too perfect for an ambush. "Keep going," I said. We passed it. My phone just loaded the directions. She made a U-turn, and as we headed back, we passed the SUV. It was going the opposite direction, and I don't think the driver saw us. We made it to the police station, where officers were waiting. They sent patrols out to search for the SUV and gave us an escort to our hotel an hour away. The rest of the trip was uneventful, but we calculated that the SUV had followed us for nearly 60 miles. We never found out if they caught the driver or what his intentions were. I was driving from Oregon to northern Idaho to visit family. I'd left work around 6 p.m., so I didn't expect to arrive until well past midnight. The top of my Jeep Cherokee was off, letting the warm summer air rush through as I cruised down the empty highway. By the time I crossed into Washington, it was already past 1 a.m. That's when the gas light flickered on, followed by the annoying beep of the fuel warning. The gas gauge had been broken for months, so I had no way of knowing how much was actually left. My sister, who'd driven the Jeep the day before, swore she'd filled it up. But clearly she'd either forgotten or lied, because I hadn't driven nearly enough to burn through a full tank. Just as I started to panic, one of those blue highway signs flashed by. I caught a glimpse of a gas pump symbol in one of the boxes and took the next exit. The road was eerily quiet, lined with dense trees on either side. I figured it would lead me to some kind of town or at least a gas station, but before I could find out, the Jeep began to sputter. The engine coughed and jerked, then died completely. I rolled to a stop on the shoulder, cursing under my breath. Out of gas. Perfect. I climbed out and called roadside assistance, explaining my situation. They said someone would be out in about 20 minutes. Annoyed but relieved, I leaned against the Jeep and scrolled through my phone, texting a few friends about my predicament. The night was dead silent. No cars, no distant hum of traffic, just the occasional chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it. Footsteps crunching through the underbrush. My first thought was a deer, maybe a raccoon. But this was cougar country, and the idea of something larger lurking in the shadows wasn't far-fetched. I walked around to the passenger side, where the sound seemed to be coming from, hoping to catch a glimpse of whatever it was. That's when I heard it. 2 sharp claps, like someone slapping their hands together. I froze. The sound was too precise, too human. I took a step closer, straining to listen. 3 more claps, louder this time. My heart raced as I called out, "Hello, is someone there?" I stood there, waiting, but the clapping didn't return. The footsteps, however, did. They were closer now, moving toward me. I scrambled back into the Jeep, locking the doors and cranking the windows up. The headlights were off, plunging me into complete darkness. Without the roof, I felt exposed. The night pressed in around me, the forest alive with sounds that suddenly felt menacing. Then I saw it, a head, peeking out from behind a tree just ahead. The face was pale, almost ghostly, like a doll's. I couldn't tell if they were looking at me. I wanted to scream, but fear had me frozen. I ducked below the dashboard, praying whatever was out there wouldn't see me. The footsteps grew louder, closer. I heard the crunch of gravel as they approached the Jeep. My heart pounded as I waited, every second stretching into an eternity. Then I felt it, a hand cold and firm, gripping the back of my shirt. I screamed, thrashing against the seat, but the hand let go as suddenly as it had grabbed me. Light flooded the area, and the rumble of an engine broke the silence. I sat up, trembling, to see the headlights of a tow truck pulling up behind me. The guy stepped out, a burly man in his 40s with a calm, reassuring presence. I practically fell out of the Jeep, babbling about what had just happened, my words tumbling. He listened patiently, then filled the tank with gas from a canister he'd brought. As he worked, I kept glancing toward the trees, half expecting to see that creepy face staring back at me. But there was nothing, just the dark, silent forest. The man handed me the empty canister and gave me a nod. "You'll be all right," he said. "Just get back on the road and don't stop until you're somewhere safe." I thanked him, though my hands were still trembling as I climbed back into the Jeep. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of that face, those dark eyes. Even now, the memory haunts me, and I can't help but wonder who was out there that night. I was supposed to meet my friend Ryan after his shift ended. He didn't have a car at the time, so I was picking him up. He said he'd be done by 7 p.m., but I got there about 15 minutes early. I texted him to let him know I was waiting. A few minutes later, he replied, apologizing and saying he'd be another hour. I wasn't mad at him, it wasn't his fault, but I was a little annoyed at the situation. Instead of sitting in the parking lot, I decided to kill time by driving around and listening to music. After a while, my stomach started growling. The only options nearby were a Burger King and a Wendy's. I went with Wendy's since it was closer. I ate in the parking lot, but I still had about 30 minutes to spare. I didn't feel like sitting still, so I kept driving, texting friends, and zoning out to music. Yeah, I know. Texting and driving isn't smart, but I was a teenager. I ended up on some back roads, driving slow. There weren't many cars around, so I figured I could get away with being on my phone a little more. That's when I noticed a car behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I sped up a bit because I was going under the speed limit, but the car caught up fast, way too fast. It got so close I thought they were going to rear-end me. "What is this guy's problem?" I muttered. He stayed glued to my bumper, 3 or 4 miles at least. I thought about brake checking him, but that would have just made things worse. There was no traffic, so he could have passed me any time. Ryan texted me saying he'd be out in 15 minutes. I told him I was on my way. That's when I started to wonder if the guy behind was following me. I made a few turns and he was still there. He backed off a little after tailing me for so long, but he didn't go away. He followed me all the way to the gas station where Ryan worked. It wasn't exactly in the middle of nowhere, but it was close. Just a few houses nearby and nothing else. When I pulled in, I realized there were no other cars around except mine and the guy who'd been following me. The guy parked right next to me, rolled down his window, and started yelling. I tried to ignore him, but he got out of his car and started banging on my window, screaming at me to unlock the door. I fumbled for my phone, hands shaking, ready to call 911. But before I could, Ryan came out of the gas station. "Hey, what are you doing?" Ryan shouted, stepping between us. The guy sneered. "What are you gonna do about it?" Ryan lifted his shirt, revealing a handgun tucked into his waistband. "Try me." The guy froze, then backed off. He got in his car and sped away. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to process what just happened. Ryan got in the passenger seat and I drove off as fast as I could. "What was that?" he asked. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. "He's been following me for miles. I thought he was going to..." I couldn't finish the sentence. Ryan shook his head. "Some people are just nuts, you okay?" I nodded, but I wasn't sure if I meant it. The guy was huge, way bigger than me, and he'd clearly been trying to intimidate me. I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if Ryan hadn't been there. I know some people hate guns, and I get it, but I hate the idea of someone like that guy having one even more. Ryan had a concealed carry permit, though I'm not sure if he was allowed to have it at work. He didn't want me to call the cops, and I didn't push it. I was just glad he'd been there. Last summer was a whirlwind. Most of it was spent hanging out with my friends, soaking up our final days before we all scattered for college. We were either at the lake, bonfires, or just driving around, looking for trouble. We were always up to something dumb or reckless, but it was all in good fun. At least, that's what I thought until that one night. It was after a small pool party at my friend Tyler's place. I was driving home around 1 a.m. with my buddy Chris in the passenger seat. The road was thick with fog, so I was going slow. We might have been idiots most of the time, but we weren't stupid behind the wheel. As we crept down the empty road, Chris suddenly pointed toward the shoulder. "Dude, what is that?" he said. I squinted through the fog. There was a figure just off the road, hunched over and dragging something into the woods. My stomach dropped. "Let's just keep going," I said. But Chris wasn't having it. "Come on, man. Pull over for a second. I want to see what's going on." Against my better judgment, I stopped the car. Chris cracked his window, and I immediately regretted it. "Don't," I hissed, but he ignored me. "Hey," Chris shouted, deepening his voice like some kind of action hero. "What are you doing out there?" We both started laughing, but it died in our throats when the figure stood up. It turned toward us, slow and deliberate, and I felt my blood run cold. It didn't move closer. Instead, it backed away, disappearing deeper into the fog until it was gone. I turned to Chris, my heart pounding. "What was that?" He didn't answer. His eyes were wide, locked on something behind me. I didn't even want to look, but I had to. When I turned, I nearly screamed. A man was pressed against my window, his face smeared with what looked like mud. His eyes were glowing red. I slammed the car into drive and hit the gas, my hands shaking on the wheel. Chris was silent for a moment, then muttered, "That wasn't mud, man. I think it was blood." We got to my house in record time and bolted inside, locking the doors behind us. Even though there was no way he could have followed us, neither of us slept that night. 2 days later, we were watching the news when a story came on about a body found in the woods near where we'd seen that man. It was an older woman, and she'd been beaten to death. My dad convinced me to call the police and tell them what we'd seen. They had us come in to give a statement, but I don't know if it helped. I try not to think about that night too much, and I definitely don't look into the case. Some things are better left buried. I'm 23, and I live in a quiet, semi-rural area where weekends can drag if you don't make plans. Every now and then, I'll drive about 45 minutes to the nearest city to hang out with a couple of friends. This past weekend was no different. I left around 6 p.m., stayed in town until midnight, and everything was fine until about 5 minutes into my drive back home. Now, I'm not a night owl. Midnight feels late to me, and by then, I was exhausted. All I could think about was getting home and collapsing into bed. I was cruising down the highway doing about 70, trying to keep my eyes open, when I saw him. A man in the middle of the road waving his arms frantically. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder just in time. My heart was pounding as I laid on the horn, more annoyed than anything. It didn't hit me right away how strange it was for someone to be out there in the middle of the night. But then he turned and stared directly at me through the driver's side window. That's when the unease set in. He looked to be in his early 30s, drenched in sweat, and his eyes were wild, like he'd just seen a ghost. Before I could say anything, he started walking toward my car. I rolled the window down just a crack, and he immediately started begging for a ride home. At the same time, he yanked on the passenger door handle, which I'd thankfully locked. "Where are you trying to go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where'd you even come from?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he kept saying, "Just let me in, and I'll explain everything." But something about him, his desperation, the way his hands shook, set off every alarm bell in my head. I told him I couldn't give him a ride, but offered to call someone for him. That's when he lost it. He started crying, then banging on my car like he was possessed. I didn't wait around to see what he'd do next. I hit the gas and sped off, watching in the rearview mirror as he tried to chase me, his figure shrinking into the darkness. About 5 minutes down the road, I pulled over and called 911. I told the operator about the guy on the highway, gave his description, and explained how he'd begged for a ride and then chased my car. The next morning, I called the police station for an update. The officer told me they'd found the guy still running in the middle of the road. What really shook me, though, was what they discovered next. He'd robbed a gas station at gunpoint just 30 minutes before I ran into him. The officer said he was probably high on something, which explained the way he was acting. But even now, I can't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd let him in my car. He was armed. Who knows what he had planned? When I was about 12 years old, my parents, my younger sister, and I were driving through a remote stretch of highway late at night. The kind of highway where the only light comes from your headlights and the occasional flicker of a distant farmhouse. We were on our way to visit relatives, and the drive had already been long and uneventful. I remember dozing off in the back seat, lulled by the hum of the tires on the asphalt. My sister was asleep next to me, her head resting against the window. My mom was in the passenger seat, scrolling through a map. This was before smartphones. And my dad was driving, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The night was pitch black, and the only sound was the occasional rush of wind as we passed through open fields. Then, out of nowhere, my dad slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a halt, jolting me awake. My sister gasped, startled, and my mom clutched the dashboard as I leaned forward to see what had caused the sudden stop. There, in the middle of the road, was a figure. They were standing perfectly still, facing away from us, their silhouette barely visible in the glow of our headlights. They were wearing what looked like a long tattered coat, and their posture was unnaturally stiff. I remember feeling a chill run down my spine, though I couldn't explain why. Something about the way they stood there, motionless, in the middle of an empty highway at night. My dad honked the horn, but the figure didn't move. Not a flinch, not a turn of the head, nothing. My mom whispered, "What do we do?" But my dad didn't answer. He just sat there, gripping the steering wheel. Then he slowly eased the car forward, steering around the figure. As we passed, I turned to look out the window, my breath fogging up the glass. The figure was gone. I blinked, thinking I must have imagined it, but my dad's sharp intake of breath told me otherwise. He sped up, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. My mom kept glancing back, her face etched with fear. My sister, still half asleep, asked what was wrong, but no one answered her. We drove in silence for the next hour, the tension in the car palpable. When we finally reached a gas station, my dad pulled in and got out to check the car. My mom stayed inside with us, her arms wrapped around herself like she was trying to ward off a chill. To this day, I have no explanation for what we saw that night.